This is going to be a small deviation from my usual content. Obviously, we're still going to be dealing with philosophy and debate, but instead of explaining things in excruciating detail, we're going to be doing more of an information dump. Because oddly enough, I think people find content like that easier to consume. You just, shut your brain off, hear a bunch of words, and enjoy the brain food. Though, of course, this is me we're talking about, and I should say that I will try to refrain from explaining things as well as I think they ought to be explained. But we all know that is a bold-faced lie. I am going to over-explain a lot of things, like how right now I am over-explaining the fact that I am over-explaining. But that being said, I thought it would just be fruitful to not necessarily try to go over fallacies and flaws and arguments comprehensively, because that could take years, and even if I tried to condense it in a single video, it would probably take several hours. But instead, I want to give you guys a broad outline of how flawed arguments can be categorized. Which isn't to say that any of this is some official thing that you can find anywhere online in any infographic or something like that. While yes, a lot of the things I will be talking about I will be taking from academic consensus, the way in which I arrange that information and by extension label a lot of this is going to be solely for the purposes of this video. And in fact, the main reason I originally decided to make this video was to show people how a lot of fallacies are being misused and misinterpreted. But I'm getting ahead of myself. For now, just know that I've outlined a sort of chart or taxonomy of flawed arguments. Some parts I will be taking from scholars, some parts will be contentious, some parts will just be things that I made up, and I'll try to keep my I'm better than the academics attitude to a minimum, but again, no, I'm not. This is me we're talking about. I'm definitely going to do that. But all of that being said, where do we start? You may expect me to start with the distinction between formal and informal fallacies. However, as I see it, first there's the distinction of what we are even saying is wrong, and more specifically from which discipline we are viewing the argument. For that, I think our journey begins with the three outermost categories in the taxonomy of flawed arguments. There is, of course, philosophy, but there is also sociology and psychology. And here, each discipline is concerned with different aspects of flawed arguments. Psychology can consider, wait for it, the psychological causes and consequences of a given argument. And so here we would study heuristics or patterns of thought meant as mental shortcuts, and from that, when these heuristics go awry, we arrive at their consequences and the effects on the individual. In psychology, you could also study biases, which can be conscious or unconscious, and include a lot of the vocabulary that we find ourselves casually slipping into conversations, such as confirmation bias, availability bias, and survivorship bias, just to name a few. In the field of sociology, it's virtually the same, except we consider things on a macro scale, looking at society as a whole and considering the effects that ideas can have on society and vice versa. This means from society we can have cultural and ideological biases, and also this is where you get into conversations about prejudice, groupthink, and other social ineptitudes. Now, none of this is to say that things like survivorship bias from psychology or prejudice from sociology cannot be examined philosophically. People who say otherwise are generally just avoiding a logical argument. Even though drawing these distinctions between disciplines is a bit arbitrary as it implies that there are multiple competing truths instead of one consistent objective truth, I'm just presenting it in this way because obviously this is just a distinction that most people make for convenience. And so that doesn't mean that the same concept can't have different names under different disciplines depending on what you are talking about. For example, availability heuristic versus hasty generalization. Also, for the purposes of our video, it's just a good place to start. We need to consider the fact that our arguments don't just exist in a void. Yes, the statements people make can be flawed, but so can the person making them, and so can the society that informs the decisions that this person makes. With this in mind, hopefully you can see why we should start with philosophy and the two other prominent social sciences. With the natural sciences, or as natural scientists would probably call it, actual science, there isn't really a wrong with physics or wrong with chemicals as there is with people, society, or the statements we make. Physics or chemistry as natural phenomena that we study can't be wrong, and any statement that is made about a natural science that is wrong because of the person, society, or statement itself. And as such, the argumentative aspect of every discipline can be said as belonging to philosophy, since philosophy, to broadly oversimplify, is the study of concepts in and of themselves, whereas sociology, for example, is less concerned with if an idea is right or wrong, and instead studying the spread, interpretation, and practice of these ideas. Likewise, psychology will only really concern itself with if an idea is wrong if it has a negative effect on the well-being of the patient. This is perhaps why most disciplines are no longer considered subsets of philosophy as they used to be, which, in case you didn't know, the P in PhD stands for philosophy. It used to mean that you were a philosopher who studied a specific aspect of philosophy. A PhD in history meant that you were a philosopher of history. A PhD in physics meant that you were a philosopher of physics. Some people still think this way, but perhaps to put put this into less contentious terms, these disciplines became more about the application of their study than the deeply philosophical underpinnings that they may or may not have, which is why they lay outside of philosophy. If you are considering the philosophical aspects of any of these, then obviously you are talking about their philosophical equivalents. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. Other than the natural sciences, which don't really factor into this chart, there may be something like cognitive science, but usually that exists as an overlap between various disciplines. Somewhere, perhaps linguistics could belong on this layer of the chart, but that just gets us into more controversy. When we say that philosophy is about our statements, where does that fall on a scale of philosophical questions involving some aspect of reality to the idea that all philosophical problems are just ones of language? That is to say, is philosophy just linguistics? Well, again, I can tell you what I'm fairly confident the answer is. Controversially, the truth is probably closer to the latter. But I'll say this, at the very least, I think we all have to concede that linguistics overlaps with philosophy. There may almost certainly be some aspects outside of philosophy that dip into the cultural aspects of sociology, like grammar and syntax, which depend on language and dialect, and even aspects that delve into psychology, for example, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. But most of the aspects of linguistics that involve concepts and their meanings are almost certainly going to be subsumed by philosophy. But seeing as I've already broken my promise to not over-explain things, let's just go ahead and move on, because as you're going to see later on, language is going to be a persistent thorn in our side. For now, let's just agree that the disciplines of sociology and psychology don't really concern us moving forward, as continuing our taxonomy of flawed arguments involves us asking the question why the arguments themselves are flawed rather than how they became flawed or their consequences on society or individuals. Philosophy, then, has several branches. The exact names and numbers vary from source to source. Commonly, there is epistemology, ontology, axiology, ethics, theology, aesthetics, metaphysics, logic, and all philosophical aspects of other disciplines, such as political philosophy, natural philosophy, linguistic philosophy, cosmology, and philosophy of the mind, to name a few. Generally, it is accepted that of these categories, there are four major branches to which most others belong. That being epistemology, of which, as far as I'm aware, certain subcategories may exist as schools of thought or differing beliefs, but other than that, there are no well-recognized subcategories. Then there is axiology, which contains aesthetics and ethics, logic, and then ontology, the study of being, which contains essentially everything else. Now, here we arrive at one of the most controversial parts of this video. I do not like how most of this is conceptualized. For example, I rarely, if ever, see anyone list out rhetoric as a branch of philosophy, which you could argue is because it should belong with linguistics or blah blah blah, because y'all will literally list off aesthetics as a branch of philosophy, but not rhetoric? Okay. And also, to some extent, I understand the division between logic and these other categories, but by saying that logic is distinct from something like ontology, are we saying that ontology lacks logical value, or that logic lacks ontological truth? I mean, I could rant on and on about this, but I'm probably just being far too critical, especially given the nature of this video. The goal here isn't to accurately label everything exactly as it should be devoid of context. We are making a taxonomy of bad arguments. In this context, these branches are slightly irrelevant. Just like psychology and sociology, which we skimmed over, these categories do nothing to explain why an argument is wrong, but instead tell us what kind of wrong it is. Epistemology is about knowledge, specifically claims of knowledge. If you make a failed knowledge claim, then it is epistemologically flawed. Axiology is about value and purpose, such as beauty or social standards. If a statement about any of those things fails, it is axiologically wrong. Ontology is about being. If a statement about reality, category, or modality is wrong, then it is ontologically wrong. In this, it's very important to understand that just because an argument is flawed in one way, that doesn't mean that it is flawed in other ways. Depending on how you conceptualize this, that may even mean that certain arguments are not flawed, but simply presented incorrectly or under the wrong context. Take, for example, circular reasoning. Many people categorize this as a fallacy, but that may not be entirely correct, especially if you consider it a logical fallacy or argue that the term fallacy means a flaw in logic. biological and even ontological standards, the sky is blue because, well, it is blue. There isn't a single logical principle that this argument violates. In fact, this is essentially modus ponens. The issue with the statement is that it violates epistemological standards. The sky being blue cannot be accepted as being true until it is a known fact. And we cannot accept it as a known fact if it is required of us to have already accepted it as a fact, since we have not yet done so. It can also be considered flawed as a matter of rhetoric, as it simply fails to convince anyone, as it requires you to have already been convinced. So while the other branches of philosophy may be important to consider, they aren't really going to factor into why something is wrong, but as I said, tell us the type of discussion in which the flaw was committed. So in the context of what we're discussing in this video, a singular argument by its own merit can either be said to fail to prove its conclusion by an objective standard, logic, or fail to convince by other standards, rhetoric. There's probably too much to actually comprehensively cover in regards to what will convince someone, as if it's left to personal whim, each person is going to have different tastes and different standards. But that little sentence right there just gave us one such standard, if it is left to personal whim. I wish I could say more people are going to be convinced by logic and reason alone, but realistically I should say some. Some people are going to be convinced by logic. Aside from logic, or logos as it is called in classical rhetoric, some people find ethos and pathos more convincing. Ethos being the character of the speaker. Is the speaker credible, trustworthy, authoritative, speaking in an engaging manner, or being polite? On the other hand, with pathos, this is emotion, or any other personal connection. You know, agree with me or I'll burn a box of puppies. If anyone ever goes through all of these videos to make a compilation of me out of context, you're welcome. Anyways, just as all of these aspects can overlap, there's also the question of clarity, which reasonably would factor into an argument's rhetorical value no matter what. After all, if you can't understand what someone is saying, how are you going to understand what they are saying? And so by that, now is where I remind you of how I said linguistics was going to be a constant thorn in our side. Because even though you really wouldn't think of something as unphilosophical as grammar to decide whether or not an argument fails, obviously here one may consider that an argument is rhetorically not good if the grammar are not the bestest. That was supposed to be a straight-faced joke, but like when I'm in these long recording sessions, I genuinely don't even know if I'm saying words, so it doesn't help. That about wraps it up for rhetoric, as anything else would have to go into why people have specific tastes, rather than why an argument by its own merit is wrong. Which, obviously, you could argue that whether or not people are convinced doesn't really come down to the merit of the argument. I mean, it's no secret that I am quite sympathetic to that point. A good argument isn't one that tricks people or makes people agree because they want to. That's called deception, manipulation, and confirmation bias. However, even I have to admit that it's difficult, if not downright impossible, to completely erase the social aspect of debate, because that entails communicators and listeners not having that social aspect in order to impart it in the first place, which is just impossible. I think even if you hate rhetoric, you have to accept it as accompanying logic as sort of a bridge between the message and our reception of it. So moving on to the message itself, logic then being hopefully the core of any argument can be further subdivided into two main categories: formal and informal fallacies. Obviously, beyond the scope of flawed arguments, there's classical logic versus non-classical logic, fuzzy logic, modal logic, and then there are different kinds or different subcategories, however you want to conceptualize it, like propositional logic, categorical logic, and so on. But the reason behind their exclusion, or at least the exclusion of most of them for now, here is essentially the same as with the branches of philosophy, in so much as covering all of that is not really the point of this video. So I'm not going to waste your time repeating myself or diving into what these concepts are and how they could shape our taxonomy. Really, these different concepts, classical logic versus fuzzy logic, just have to do with how you conceptualize truth values. Is there just true and false, or is it more like a spectrum of partial truths? Again, here we're just going to keep it simple and focus on classical logic. But what I will do, however, is give you some food for thought on a few concepts that even I myself don't really know how to convey. Formal and informal logic are two separate worlds, but they are also the same world, and anytime you're talking about formal logic, that is deduction, and anytime you're talking about informal logic, that is induction, but also that's probably not true. Let me explain. Formal logic, as its name implies, deals with the form or structure of an argument, hence form in formal. It doesn't deal with context. If you take a formal fallacy like denying the antecedent, it doesn't matter what you substitute for these variables. Rain causes the ground to be wet. If it did not rain, then the ground will not be wet. This is invalid because there are other reasons why the ground could be wet without the rain, and the statement will, for the most part, always be invalid, but not because of the context. We could have chosen any other example. This is a fallacy because we were never given that A is the only cause of B. We don't have sufficient information to rule out that B could happen through another means. And that right there, rule out. This is why it's so important to understand at the very least how integral deduction is to formal logic. Aside from general propositional fallacies, the only major group of note in formal fallacies are syllogistic fallacies. There are only about a dozen syllogistic fallacies. Some syllogistic fallacies include fallacy of four terms, illicit negative, fallacy of the undistributed middle, and fallacy of the illicit minor. I would say that joke never gets old, but I've only used it twice, right? It already feels old. Unlike the illicit minor, I should say. Also here with syllogisms, there are unconditionally invalid syllogisms and conditionally valid ones, which is a concept to be aware of with all formal fallacies, not just syllogistic ones. We'll come back to that later. First, in case you don't know, a syllogism is just a statement structured like all A are B, all B are C, therefore all A are C. That was an example of an AAA1 syllogism, which is an unconditionally valid syllogism. Looking at a list of syllogism types may be daunting, but an easy way of working through a syllogism is just to consider its diagram, where we are simply eliminating what cannot be in order to conclude what remains. In other words, what we keep seeing pop up time and time again. Deduction. Although, for clarity, it's not really in the Sherlock Holmes sense where whatever remains must be the truth. Because, for the most part, formal logic is about validity, not truth. Validity is the notion that if you put junk in, you get junk out. However, if you put good stuff in, that is, you have true premises and a valid argument, then that is called a sound argument, which yields a true conclusion. This leads us naturally to ask what makes the content itself of what we put into an argument true. Well, that brings us to informal logic. Where formal logic was about form, informal logic is about content and context. To finally wrap up a point I alluded to earlier and have since been dancing around for all this time, formal and informal logic have a strange relationship with each other and with deduction and induction that I largely see go unrecognized. For example, deduction kept popping up as an underlying principle in formal logic, whereas a lot of inductive reasoning can be seen to conflict with formal logic. Affirming the consequent is a formal fallacy. However, taking an observation and inferring a cause is the very premise of inductive reasoning, and likewise a key aspect of informal logic. Now, there are a lot of questions that can muddy the waters here. An argument could be made that inductive reasoning is an incomplete form of deductive reasoning, since when you provide more specific instances, the more likely you are to be correct. And also, at a certain point, instead of going from specific to general, you now start in the general, as you do in deductive reasoning. But in the same way, deductive reasoning can surprisingly be challenged. Statements made in a void like if A then B, where we never assume the truth of an observation, can be considered unconditionally true. But what about meaningful deductive arguments? In order to start your deduction, how do you know that you have all the facts such that the elimination of all other possibilities necessitates one truth? This should probably be its own video. And the exact way I conceptualize this is something I haven't entirely set in stone. So I just want to boil it down to this. You will notice odd relationships between informal and formal fallacies, such as the fact that some people will claim that they can overlap, but this doesn't really seem to be the case. Here's what I mean. With informal logic, you have equivocation. But if it were to pop up in a syllogism, you would have a fallacy of four terms, which is a formal fallacy. If you deny the antecedent, that's a formal fallacy. But if it's in the context of P is a flawed statement, therefore Q is false, then you have an argument from fallacy, which again is an informal fallacy. There are dozens of examples just like this. However you want to conceptualize it, you need to understand that formal and informal logic are almost yin and yang, examining two different aspects of logic, namely structure and content or context. Some sources would claim that something like argument from fallacy is a special case of denying the antecedent, but this is clearly in some respect wrong. It is merely that both fallacies coexist in the same argument, as one is challenging the content and the other is challenging the structure. And likewise, with arguments from fallacy in mind, some people conflate the standards and importance of informal fallacies and formal fallacies. If you commit an informal fallacy and someone tells you that what you are saying is false, then that is likely an argument from fallacy. If, on the other hand, you concede as a premise, if P then Q, and then argue P therefore not Q, that isn't just invalid, that is unconditionally false, or at the very least, either your premise or your conclusion is inarguably false. But that's just something to be aware of, and I suppose I'm at risk of going off on a tangent. So, point being, these distinct categories have different standards and different amounts of sway behind them. Too many people get overconfident with informal logic, thinking they've proven something, when informal arguments don't really deal with validity in the same way as formal arguments. Technically, it's a similar concept, but it goes by a different name. In both inductive reasoning and informal logic, arguments can range from being weak to being strong. A strong argument here is said to be cogent. Informal fallacies are, as this may imply, not generally as concrete in their rules, having many exceptions. However, there does seem to be a fair deal of consensus that there are, broadly speaking, three main types of informal fallacies. There are fallacies of relevance, such as ad hominem, appeal to emotion, and the red herring fallacy, as well as pretty much every fallacy that begins with appeal to. The issue with these fallacies are, as the name implies, relevance. And here again, this is what I meant when I said that this video should help clear up common misconceptions about fallacies. You see, there has been no, and spoilers, will be no category of fallacy called being a big fat meanie fallacy. Insulting someone may be rhetorically unconvincing, but logically it has nothing to do with ad hominem, or why ad hominem is a fallacy. Ad hominem is a fallacy of relevance, meaning that it is wrong because if we are talking about something else, and I imply that your character is relevant to the argument, I'm wrong because it is not. However, in instances where your character is actually the center of the discussion, then clearly it is relevant. In addition to relevance, there are fallacies of presumption, such as false dichotomy, hasty generalization, and post hoc. These are fallacies where something is assumed to be the case without actual sufficient evidence to support it. And finally, there are fallacies of ambiguity, in which things are not made clear, such as equivocation and reification. I did exclude a category that is brought up somewhat commonly, that is fallacies of insufficient evidence. However, that clearly just describes fallacies of presumption, as you assume that there is sufficient evidence when there in fact is not. And I know someone could try to use that against me and say, well, you assume something is relevant when it's not, or you assume something is clear when it's not, but that's clearly just talking about the argument very superficially. How could you possibly make an assumption with sufficient evidence? If that was the case, then it wouldn't be an assumption, now would it? A few other groups that have been proposed are fallacies of inconsistency, which is more so a concept that we have yet to cover that I will probably call a principle of form, specifically non-contradiction, and as such shouldn't really be considered an informal fallacy. Then there are fallacies of distraction, which is clearly just another word for relevance, though perhaps trying to make a statement about intent. Causal fallacies, which doesn't really describe why the arguments are wrong, just what they are wrong about. And fallacies of explanation, which I guess is when you fail to explain something. I don't know.
The joke here is that I failed to explain it.
But wrapping this up, I just want to address what I'm going to call, for simplicity's sake, oddball fallacies. These are fallacies that either don't really have a clear place to go, or their placement may just be contentious. For example, as we just mentioned, the very concept of being inconsistent. I get that something like that may be heavily reliant on context, but as we've sort of seen, frustratingly, all of this is interconnected. You can't have meaningful statements without form, and you can't have the application of form without content. So I think the issue in classification more so comes down to asking yourself, can the context change and it still be wrong or not? If it's context dependent, it's informal. So yes, we need context to inform an inconsistency, but the exact context doesn't matter. If you say A is B and not B, that violates the law of non-contradiction and the law of identity. These I would classify as formal rules, and their violations formal fallacies. However, some may contend that these are rules that govern all of logic in general. general. There are also a lot of things like performative contradictions, which I'm going to be honest, I don't even know how to classify. Likewise, I could classify categorical fallacies as formal fallacies for the same reason I gave for fallacies of inconsistency. But my Snapchat AI said that they were informal, so I don't know. Generally, AIs are terrible at understanding philosophy, but I'm just covering all of my bases. I struggled to find a lot of this, but if I had to guess, that's probably because, as I am constantly saying, that's not how fallacies work. I don't think philosophers just go around like trying to memorize and collect fallacies like they're Pokemans. It's generally just a better idea to work through them rationally. So without doing that and diving headfirst into deeply philosophical concepts, this is where this video has to come to an end, because anything else would require a lot of explanation. Not that I didn't already break my promise to not over-explain things, but you know, I don't imagine you guys would want to watch like a 10-hour video, and I definitely would not want to make one. I just wanted to make a short but clear outline as to how an argument can go wrong, and hopefully this gives you a lot to think about. Are you considering personal, cultural, and ideological biases when crafting an argument? Do you understand the concepts that you are conveying in your statements? Are you saying that something is true, that it should be true, or that something is known? And with that in mind, are you providing an argument that meets that specific criteria? Is your argument convincing, moving, and compelling to people? And even if it has no need to be, is it clear or capable of being understood? If your argument is deductive, is there any flaw in its structure? And if you're compelled to make an inductive argument to acquire the premises for your deductive argument, or you just choose to make an inductive argument from the start, is your argument relevant to its conclusion? Does your argument rely on assumptions, not considering as much evidence as possible to make a strong case? And finally, are your premises and conclusion clear? Not only do these questions provide a checklist for us to correct ourselves and others, but once you can go down the list and confirm that you have a deductive or inductive argument that is unbiased, purposeful, compelling, clear, relevant, well-supported, and disambiguous, then almost certainly you will have a very, very good argument.